Hi, scholars. Today we are looking at chapter 6 and 7 from our African American Studies textbook. I'm going to try to do a quick summary of both chapters. Chapter 6 starts on page 71. It's African American Studies, Discourses and Paradigms. And then chapter 7 starts on page 84, and that chapter is Afrocentricity and Africology theory and practice in the discipline. And these two chapters are from part 2, African American Studies, Theories and Methodologies. If we start with chapter 6 first, on page 71, it's giving you context again about what has been discussed in some of the earlier chapters about the development of African American studies and its primary discourses and paradigms in terms of when it was established. In the background section on that first page of 71, they give you a little context about key historical movements that are happening and key players and events that are the backdrop for African American studies or Black studies to get developed within academia. And I think one point that is really key to understand in this early couple of sections here is this notion that you can't be political and academic. So if you notice at the bottom of page 71 and going into page 72, there's discussions that if you use terms like nationalist or political, that's the opposite of being academic or researchy, like a researcher. And it's a way to render silence in the fields because obviously the two are not mutually exclusive. We have a lot of academics that are very politically active and take their knowledge and work with communities and make changes in the larger society. And a key theme that is brought up in this chapter is at the very bottom of page 72, and then I will continue some of the points onto page 73. But on page 72, it says that it's like in the middle of that final chunk paragraph there at the end. In those terms, the fundamental issue was how to determine what constitutes valid knowledge about the subject, the experiences, conditions, and aspirations of Black folks. The very premise that there could be an intellectually valid Black perspective on these matters was a fundamental challenge to the epistemological foundation on which universities functioned. So the author of this chapter is trying to get you to understand that there is a battle happening in academia to get this new discipline and this new field of study accepted in the spaces that have often been denied this type of knowledge. And so one way the author talks about the slow integration, and this is on page 73 at the top, is that many institutions ended up adding a class here or there in other fields of study, such as history or literature. And in that way, they integrated Black ideology or Black theory or Black scholarship in areas of academia that were already accepted. So rather than have an entire new department of African American Studies, well, we're now offering a African American Studies literature course in the English department. And isn't this great and we're celebrating and being inclusive, right? And so there was different approaches being taken. And I mean, you could even consider here at LMC, we have key classes and different disciplines, but we have yet to have an ethnic studies department or a Black studies department, right? And yet you can find these kinds of spaces in universities and at the UC levels and in private colleges as well. So I think that it's important to understand that there is resistance at the university level, at the college, at the community college level to acknowledge this new field of study, because African American studies and Black studies is very new in relative comparison to other more established fields. As you continue on in this chapter, I do think it's important to point out on page 74 that there are certain discourses that surround Black studies and African American studies. It's the first full paragraph on page 74. It says, thus, although the discourse around African American studies was often framed in terms of political ideology and or organizational structure, it was in fact a set of underlying epistemological issues of determining what and who, in fact, constitutes valid knowledge about Black people and Black communities, that united the various groups of the Black Studies movement, for whom mere inclusionism and contributionism regarding Blacks was insufficient. So it was decided that no, having one or two classes on African American history or African American literature is not enough. We want more, right? So the authors explain that there is a necessary epistemic renovation they sought would require totally restructured analytical frameworks to effect a wholesale disruption of Eurocentric master narratives. And so they're saying, the author is saying that you have to disrupt the status quo and this white, white Eurocentric understanding of education, of history, of literature, of the different fields of study, right? And so having its own field of study and its own department and its own autonomy is very important for that disruption. And so it becomes very, very cultural and revolutionary in the way it changed academic landscapes and for the better. So there's some key points that are talked about on page 76, as well as the difference of Afrocentrism, which will be talked about in the next chapter. So I'm not going to go into that in this chapter, but it's at the top of page 76. In the middle of 76, there's a quote that Black studies evolved from a movement to an institutionalized field of inquiry, and they talk about the first and largest Black studies PhD program at Temple University and how important that space was to this institutionalism of the field of study. And then they do go into some two key themes that are pointed out by the lead scholar in the movement, Asante. And the first is the central concern with language as a critical linchpin in the construction of knowledge, meaning, identity, and culture. And second is the continual reference to African ideas, culture, and histories as backdrops for the alternative construction of knowledge. And it's this dismantling of this understanding that becomes very prevalent in a dominant understanding of what civilization is and what Western civilization is. And they talk about it a little bit at the bottom of page 76 of undermining the notion that Greece and Rome is where high culture started, and actually disrupting that and acknowledging Egyptian, and specifically Black Egyptian culture history as the epitome of Western civilization. And so that's also talked a little bit more in the next chapter. I'm going to end this chapter with just a couple of notes before we move on to chapter 7 about key sections that you might want to read more closely, such as gender and women's studies and how that influences or affected the scholars in Black studies. And there's quite a few people listed, including many names you might have heard of, such as Audre Lorde, Gloria Hall, Claudia Tate, and of course Patricia Hill Collins and Bell Hooks. And then they talk a little bit, the author talks a little bit about discourses of transformation and the global aspect to Black studies and how that is changing the discipline. And it ends, I love how this chapter ends starting on page 79, but it goes through 81. Critical race theory is discussed. And I might include a little bit more details about that in the module of work or in a later module of work, because there's so much in media right now about how terrible critical race theory is. And actually, it's a very empowering field of discourse, and it's used in many ethnic studies disciplines, including Black studies and African American studies. So I think that's really important to understand. Now I want to transition us very briefly, because I always seem to talk more than I mean to, on chapter 7, Afrocentricity and Africology, Theory and Practice in the Discipline. So I really like that this chapter starts off by answering one of the key terms with, explaining the key term in the title with a question of what is Afrocentricity? And it's defined in that very first paragraph, very first couple of sentences, and I'm going to read it really quickly now. It's on page 84. Afrocentricity is a philosophical paradigm that emphasizes the centrality and agency of the African person within an historical and cultural context. As such, it is a rejection of the historic marginality and racial alterity often expressed in the ordinary paradigm of European racial domination. And you might read that and you might think, whoa, what does that mean? What is the author trying to say about that? And the key point, one of the key points to understand is that centralizing of the narrative of the history of the subject. It's no longer on the margins, right? And so African history and the African person and the African scholar is in the center, and they are recognized and they are self-determined, and part of it is related to what was in the previous chapter about acknowledging the incredible contributions that African society has given not only its own communities and people, but the entire world, right? And so, I mean, there's just powerful statements being made all over in this chapter. And at the bottom of page 84 up to 85, ending the chapter, there's another really great way to understand Afrocentricity. Afrocentricity announces itself as a form of anti-racist, anti-patriarchal, and anti-sexist ideology that is new, innovative, challenging, and capable of creating exciting ways to acquire and express knowledge. That statement is just so powerful. It really encapsulates why we should care about Afrocentricity and African American studies and Black studies, because it is about liberation. It is about anti-racism. It is about making the world a better place. And so I just really love how the author expresses that right there at the beginning. So as you continue on and you're reading this section, there's a whole bunch of name dropping happening here. Big theorists, big scholars in the field. And I mean, I went through and I was kind of like circling people I knew or starring people that I've read on, and then maybe even highlighting. I had a couple of question marks of people that I want to read more about. The author isn't going to talk about all of their contributions, but you might go through on some of these names and decide, who you might want to learn more about with your own research and your own scholarship. Like if something is catching your interest as you are reading this chapter. The authors explain the other terms such as Afrocentric and Afrocentric on page 86. And that's also where the schools of thought, there's a section called schools of thought, in which there are more important people being discussed and named. And there is power in literally the naming of all of these individuals who have contributed to such an important aspect of Black studies and African American studies. And I do think that you want to consider what it means to have agency, what it means to be centered, and what it means to have that culture and that pride in African culture, right? As you're continuing on, let's see. There is a really good section on page 88 through 89 with the 5 distinguishing characteristics of Africology. And so you can read that and see if you have questions about it after you read those 5 points. And I think, again, on page 89, the author does a really good job of summarizing how this entire theory, field of study is about the liberation of the mind from very harmful European ideological mindsets that have become ingrained in education. And specifically, they mention here how Europe becomes a teacher and Africa is a pupil, and that this idea needs to be dismantled because it's false and it's harmful. And they talk a little bit about different scholars within that are Afrocentrists that are not African, and that it's not about the race, but it's about that centeredness in the analysis that is key. So that's at the bottom of 89. There's a really good section on a Senegalese scholar on page 91 that you should definitely read up very closely, because it's one of the few names that are mentioned in which the author goes into depth on the contributions of that particular scholar. And then I do want to end, because the lecture is getting kind of long, with page 93, the principal concepts. And so it's the second paragraph on page 93. 4 areas of inquiry in Afrocentricity. They are cosmological, axiological, aesthetic, and epistemological. And the author does a really good job in that big paragraph breaking down what those 4 areas of inquiry actually mean in regards to Afrocentricity. And so I think you should read that pretty closely. And as always, if you have questions, you can reach out via email about the lecture. I do want to end with the conclusion on page 96 with the metaphor of location. I think, again, Asante, our author, does a really good job with this conclusion. Afrocentricity creates, among other things, a critique of human communication and social history in the search for a unique standing, place for agency. Such an action is at once a liberalizing and a liberating event, marking both the expansion of consciousness and the freeing of the mind from hegemonic thinking. And so really that's what I hope that this class as well is really causing within you as you are reading these chapters and thinking about the materials and doing the assignments. What does it mean to free your mind from hegemonic thinking? Can you view the world and the discipline, specifically Black studies, in an empowering way that not only empowers the Black community, but empowers the global community and your own experiences? How can you use what you are learning in your future careers? So I will leave you with that. And like I mentioned, please reach out via email with any questions.